Thank you so much, Nina. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you, and I feel badly that I'm sort of have my back to you, but I don't mean to. I'll try and make sure that you're part of it. Yes, it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you, and thank you for that really kind introduction. I so appreciate the First Nations of this region who've lived here for, thank you, how's that? Who've lived here for thousands of years and have looked after the lands and waters of this place. In particular, I want to raise my hands to the peoples of the Lower Mainland here, the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Tsawwassen, and also to the people in Vancouver Island, where I've done a lot of my work and where I live, the Snuneymuxw, the Cowichan, the Saanich, the Songhees, and the other peoples of Vancouver Island. Haichka, Haichka, Tleiko, Tleiko. And just for fun, the other evening, a couple days ago, I took this photo from our home on Protection Island, looking east across Gabriola Island as the full moon came up. And it was just spectacular. I just thought I'd share that with you. There's so many people. I could spend the whole evening just talking about each one of these individual knowledge keepers I've worked with over the years. And I just want to go through them and mention them by name, because a lot of what I'm sharing with you was shared with me by these people, many of whom have passed away now, but they're still with me always. Starting with Sam Mitchell from the Slatlamuxw Nation up near Lillooet, with a digging stick made out of a deer antler, digging up balsam root. Quaxistalo Watla from the Kwakwakkwak Tsawadena Nation, an amazing knowledge keeper, the one who provided us with the word that means keeping it living, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Selena Tamoyakan from the Okanagan Silich Nation. My friend Satlama Joan Morris from the Songhees Nation, and a dear friend who shared her name, Satlama, with me. Dr. Mary Thomas from the Secwepemc Nation, Dr. Margaret Saiwallace from the Nujulk Bellacoola Nation. Dr. Luschim Arvid Charlie from the Cowichan Nation. Cyril Carpenter from up in the corner there from the Heiltsuk Nation. Annie York from the Ntlakatmuk Nation around Spuzim. Chief Ron Ignace, who's still with us, Chief up at Skeetchiston in Secwepemc Territory. Elsie Claxton from the Saanich Nation. Dr. Umik Richard Atleo from the Nuu-chah-nulth Nation, and I just saw him a couple of days ago. Wonderful man who was the co-chair of the Clayoquot Scientific Panel many years ago, which is how I got to know him. Ernie Hill, Chief Ernie Hill from Hartley Bay from the Gitga'at Nation. Pauline Waterfall from the Heiltsuk Nation. Ida Jones from the Dididat Pachidat Nation, and finally Helen Clifton from the Gitga'at Nation, who is celebrating nearly her 100th birthday. I'm not sure, right around there, and I've known her for a long time. So these people, and many others, but these in particular I'll be talking about as we go through these slides. I also wanted to pay tribute to my dear friend Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who is supposed to be speaking here in Vancouver tomorrow night, and I was going to stay over to hear her. She's in Syracuse, New York, however, and the weather didn't cooperate, so she wasn't able to come. But her talk will be on Zoom, as I understand it, so you might try to find out more about it. But on the way over, I came on the Hello Ferry, and I had the privilege of reading Robin's latest book called Serviceberry. And I thought just to pay her tribute, because her second book, she's done 3. One is Gathering Moss, because she's a moss specialist. One is called Braiding Sweetgrass, and that's my all-time favorite book. And then this book, which is small and a very easy read, which I enjoyed reading on the way over. So I'll just read you a little passage. She's talking about the serviceberry or Saskatoonberry, after which the city of Saskatoon is named, from the Cree word for that berry. I can't help but gaze on them, these shiny gems cupped in my hand, and breathe out my thanks. In the presence of such gifts, gratitude is the intuitive first response. This gratitude flows toward our plant elders and radiates to the rain, to the sunshine, to the improbability of bushes spangled with morsels of sweetness in a world that can be bitter. So that's just like one little passage, but you get the feeling that she's writing from the heart, and she always does. And I really recommend her book to you if you haven't had a chance to see it yet. And there, my also a dear friend from Bella Coola, Esther Hands, down in the estuary of the Bella Coola River with sweetgrass growing there. We have sweetgrass growing up and down our coast as well. But they said, the people in Bella Coola, that long ago some Blackfoot people came out to the coast and they showed them how they use sweetgrass as smudging for ceremonial purposes. So they learned about people exchange knowledge all the time, as well as plants, and that's just one example.
Nancy, I just checked the West Van Library website. Robin Wall Cabaret will be on tomorrow night on Zoom.
Excellent. So if people want to hear,
westvanlibrary.ca.
Okay, thank you very much. That's excellent. And I also want to pay tribute to Luschi Marvit Charlie, who I had the privilege of working with on this book, one of the latest published books. He grew up he knew his great-grandfather, whose name was Luschi, who was born in the 1880s. And so as a boy, he learned from this very knowledgeable elder, as well as his grandparents and his father, who was a very well-known artist in Duncan as well. But it was a privilege to work with Luschi on this book. And just a few others, I won't go into them, but there's the Ancient Pathways book. But there's a bunch of other ones which I've relied on over the years. Kat Anderson's work in California, Tending the Wild, was one of the first eye-openers for me. Kat Anderson did her master's working with First Nations in California, looking at the way they harvested the sandbar willow to make baskets, and how they coppiced the willow to make lots of shoots for baskets. And that was really interesting to think how that was one of the first times I heard about people actually tending plants and keeping them living and that sort of thing. And then there's Doug Doers in my book, Keeping It Living, based on the word that Quatsistela taught us, that means keeping it living in the Kwakwala language. My friend Dana Leposki has done some wonderful work as well, and Chelsea Armstrong, so many others, friends and allies and people who I've worked with over the years have taught me a lot. So I want to give an introduction, just a quick overview of the area that I'm talking about, tell you a couple of stories, talk about environmental knowledge of Indigenous peoples and how that incorporates ways of looking after the land, and give you a few examples. So these represent some of the information I'm going to talk about. The yarrow an alder tree that has had a piece cut out of the bark to be used for medicine, but the tree is still living, and soapberries, which I'll talk about a little. I don't know how that one got in there. Must have come from another talk. Slipped in just to tease me. So there, in the area that I've been working in, from central Alaska south to the Columbia River and east to the Rockies, there are about 50 major language groups of Indigenous peoples, and some of these languages, some of their languages are related to each other, like the Athabascan languages, or Athabascan, the Carrier, Dakelth, Tsilhqot'in, Tahltan, Sekani. They're all related, and you can tell from the similarities in their languages. They're all the Salishan languages, the coastal ones and the interior ones. Again, you can see how people have shared knowledge and and how the knowledge has been distributed across the country and across cultures by looking at the words for the plants that people use and the ways that they use them. Just a quick example. No, I'll tell you later. Forget that. Camas and onion, remind me. Okay. And there, as well as the practical knowledge that we talk about, the weeding and the tending and the way you cut, the way you harvest things, the seasons and all of that, there's a lot of narratives and ceremonies and traditions that relate to these and that support them and help people remember them over time. I'll talk about that a little bit. And then, as I said, there's strong evidence of sharing knowledge, techniques, and values across these borders, geographic and linguistic, as well as time borders. So, okay, Quashlash. Quashlash, the name, is originally for, in Proto-Salish times, a name for edible bulb. And in some of the languages, say on Vancouver Island, Quashlash is the name for camas, which I'll be talking about. But over time, it transferred itself into the name for onion, nodding onion. In the Slatlimuk language, for example, that Sam Mitchell taught me, Kolawa Ul is the name. It means real original onion in their language for nodding onion. And then it spreads over into Okanagan and into Salish, or the Flathead people. They call Koliwa another species of onion. So the same word gets changed around depending on the geographic and vegetational situation that people find themselves in. It makes it really interesting. So knowledge isn't just passed on straight way, but is adapted to given cultures and given places. So this shows a map, just so you can see the diversity there. On the left, more or less the territories of the different language groups, and on the right, the major environmental zones or ecological zones. And when you superimpose these on top of each other, you get this tremendous biocultural diversity that makes the knowledge so rich and interesting.
Can you read the names of the 3 language groups?
Well, there are many language groups.
Oh, that are listed at the bottom, the 3 lists.
Oh, sorry.
The language families. Or language families, rather.
There would be the Salishan language family. The Wakashan language family is the Kwakwa, and Nuu-chah-nulth and Dididat, and Heiltsuk and Haisla up the coast. There's the Athabascan language family that I mentioned already, Chilcotin, and believe it or not, the Navajo and Apache are related to that language group. They speak Athabascan language so they traveled down into their territory a long, long time ago, but they still have some words, like the word for birch is the same in Chilcotin and Navajo. So that's kind of interesting. Then there's some languages, namely Haida and Tanaha or Kootenai, that are called isolates. Nobody knows any related languages outside of those ones. And there's different dialects of Haida, but the Haida have been there on Haida Gwaii for probably since the glaciers, probably 14,000 years or more. And
because the glaciers didn't get there, did they?
no, parts of Haida Gwaii were unglaciated, that's true. So that they would have lived there and the sea level would be going up and down, but the original Haida were probably there back then. Some of the archaeological work has shown that. And of course, here we have what Nina already shared with you, that these people have always been called hunter-gatherers here in the northwest area of North America. And the implication for that is that it's just random picking and plucking of what they want when they need it or when they can find it. And that is really not the case at all, as I learned over time. So I want to tell you a story about Quaxistala, Clan Chief Adam Dick from the Tawadena Nation. He is a dear friend, passed away a few years ago now, but his wife, Kim Rakalma Clutisi, I just saw last week, which was really nice. So he, as I said, he grew up at a time when he was kept away from residential school. And so his elders hid him away and they trained him as a hereditary chief would be trained to look after the land and to look after the people. So he spent his childhood with his grandparents, and he went down with his mother and his grandmother to the Tequilak root gardens at the mouth of the Kingcome River, where they went every year, and they had plants that they tended and looked after, the clover, the springbank clover. Well, I'll show you in the next slide. And so there he is showing where the original Tequilak root gardens were at the mouth of the Kingcome River. And he was saying how important those root vegetables were for him, and they looked after them. So there they are, the Nootka lupin, Quani, the silverweed, Tlaksam, the clover, Taxus, and the rice root, Huquam, the northern rice root, which is in the lily family and has those chocolate appearing flowers. And so he was telling me, yeah, that was my job when I was little, to pick them off. He said he talked about this something on the bottom of the Huquam. They called it the Gagum, which means grandfather. And that was my job, to pick those off and throw them back in the ground. I thought, what? So I couldn't figure out what he was talking about. And so I said, so Adam, is the Gagum going to grow into a new plant? He said, yes, that's why we did it. You dummy? No, he didn't say that. But I felt like a dummy to ask that question, but I had to, because I'd never heard of people replanting things. I'd never heard that before. So that very year, I was working up in the interior, working with Dr. Mary Thomas, our dear friend from the Nisconwith Nation. And she was talking about how she would go up into the subalpine meadows with her mother and grandmother. And they would, to dig shwih. Shwih is the yellow glacier lily. It has a long, sometimes they call it bear tooth. It has a long, slender corm. And they have little cormlets at the bottom of that. And she said, yeah, we would, right in there, we only took the big ones and we buried back the little ones. And when you look at the root, there's a little, right at the end, it looks like it's got little whiskers. And you took that off and throw it back in the soil where it's growing so it would grow back again. I thought, wow, that's so neat. She said when they go down to the camp and they're cleaning the roots that they dug that day, they make a little pile with the whiskers and then bring them back up the next day and put them back in the ground. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. 2 elders who don't speak the same language, didn't know each other, in 2 different places, one in the tidal area, one in the montane area, with 2 different roots, but doing exactly the same thing. That's just amazing. That started me on this learning journey. And then some years later, I was up in Bella Bella and was out on the boat with the late Cyril Carpenter. And he started talking about his grandmother telling him that they had berry gardens. And along Roscoe Inlet, some of you who are boaters will know where that is. He said by the fish camp they had there was a waterfall that came down. And they used to take plants, berry bushes, huckleberries, blueberries, and plant them beside the waterfall there on the south-facing slope. And they would take the fish guts and the other detritus that they had from their fish camp and bury it around the roots of the plants that they planted. And that, they said, you could just pick the berries off by the handful when they did that. And my friend Pauline Waterfall, who I mentioned already, her grandmother and Cyril's grandmother were related. And she said the same thing. Her grandmother told her the same thing. So Cyril had passed away, but with Jennifer, his widow, and Chief Harvey Humshett and Brenda Humshett and several other friends, we went up to Roscoe Inlet and we tried to find the location of the berry garden, which would have been about 80 years ago if you count back to the grandmother's generation. We think we found it by the waterfall, and there were berries growing there really nicely, but it was pretty grown up with trees as well. So we don't know for sure, but it was interesting to see that. So just to back up a bit and talk about Indigenous knowledge, my friend Fikret Burkus from University of Manitoba and author of Sacred Ecology has given a pretty good definition of Indigenous or traditional ecological knowledge, a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations of cultural transmission. And when we think of cultural transmission, there's a lot of ways to tell people, to teach people. Telling stories is a good one, but also experiential learning, learning by doing, learning by being there. And that's what's happening there in that photo with Helen Clifton and her little granddaughter Janelle, who's now fully grown up. But in that picture, Janelle has her little pounding hammer and they're pounding on yew wood blocks and they're pounding halibut walks, which are dried slabs of halibut that they pound to make them soft and then store them for winter. And Janelle's not even probably recognizing that she's learning anything. She's just having fun with her grandma, but she'll never forget that. Her whole life, she'll bring that, and it'll be there whenever she hears that sound, whenever she does something with the hammer, she'll think of that. So that's part of the cultural transmission. And of course, people have lots of teachers, and some of those teachers are the other animals. If we think about the bear, that's where a grizzly bear had dug up the rice root in the Kitlope Valley. That's where you can see my Swiss Army knife there. That's not part of the root. Just a, measure. But also bears, when they pick berries, they scatter berries around. They don't eat them all. Some of them get dropped, and then they turn into a big berry patch. So people will often do the same thing. When they pick a basket of berries, they'll take a handful at the end, throw it over their shoulder to make more berries. So there's a lot of learning that can go on from animals. The beaver, when it cuts a willow, and if you see a year or so later after the cut, you'll see that there's long withes coming out, growing out from behind the cut. And those are what people could use to make baskets with. And so people learn how to coppice and imitate the beaver. And I love this quote. It was from the field notes of James Tate. Some of you know the book about James Tate now that my friend Wendy Wickwire wrote, At the Bridge. He was an amazing man who came from the north of Scotland and settled in Spence's Bridge, married an Tlakatmilk woman. And he made all kinds of wonderful documentation of the plants and cultural uses and stories of his people, the Tlakatmilk people. But this is what I found in his handwritten notes. Flowers, plants, and grass, especially the latter, are the covering or blanket of the earth. If too much plucked or ruthlessly destroyed, earth's sorry and weeps. It rains or is angry and makes rain, fog, and bad weather. And of course, you guessed it, that's where the inspiration for my book, The Earth's Blanket, came from, was from that quote. But that's something that people are taught, children are taught. You don't just pull up and wreck things just for the fun of it. You're very careful and thoughtful and respectful. And there is the word that Adam taught us, and I won't even try to pronounce it because I don't want to say it wrong, but it translates as keeping it living, and it's the way that people look after what they harvest, the way they harvest, and how they look after the plants and animals, the fish and the clams. Adam was the one who first defined the clam gardens. When we asked him about it, about what my friend John Harper was seeing from the air, these stone walls along the beach, he said, "Oh yeah, that's our Lokiwe. Lok means rolling in Kwakwala. Lokiwe is the name for clam garden that he gave." And so he's contributed so much over the years, but that was the inspiration for the book that Doug Doerr and I edited called Keeping It Living. And here's some of the practices which Nina, I think, mentioned already. Tilling, weeding, fertilizing, pruning, replanting, transplanting, use of fire, altering habitat, building up benches and making berry gardens, and also proprietorship, ownership. People, individuals and families in different communities had the oversight of particular areas, and that was their responsibility. And it wasn't just so they could benefit from the results, but so that they could be sure to look after those areas and pass the knowledge and the care on to the next generation. So you see this keeping it living philosophy in many, many ways, but here's Mary Thomas. You have to be very careful. She made the most beautiful birch bark baskets, and she knew how to cut the bark off the outside without harming the tree. You have to be careful that you don't cut through that thin pulp that covers the tree. If you cut right through, the sap will start to come out, and you deprive the tree of the sap. And so once you take that off, it turns into a hard surface, protects the tree, the pulp, the juice will still go up and make the leaves, and it keeps the tree alive. So that's very important. You can harvest birch bark without killing the tree. And here, this is from Franz Boas's writing, working with the Kwakwakwa back in the early 1900s. And this is what he was told. they do not take all of the cedar bark. For the people of the olden times said that if they should peel off all the cedar bark, the young cedar would die. Then another cedar tree nearby would curse the bark peeler so that he would also die. Therefore, the bark peelers never take all the bark off a young tree. That's pretty explicit. You don't get that kind of wording too often, but everybody knows that you just take one strip off a tree. All up and down the coast, we have what they call CMTs, culturally modified trees, where you can see people have taken slabs of bark off and the tree is still living. I've been up in the Gitgat territory in their seaweed camp at Kiel. There's a tree back there, 500 years old or so, that has had maybe 4 slabs taken off at different times to be used for roofing. But the tree is still living. It's pretty amazing. And then people use fire a lot. And this is particularly important right now when we're facing the threat of all these fires, and we've seen them up in the Chilcotin and elsewhere. Fires that have happened because burning of the sort that the First Nations did in the past was banned in the early 1900s. About the time Smokey the Bear was born, people were prohibited and would be put in jail if they practiced burning. So there are not too many people today who know how to do it, but there are a few. So a lot of these plants, the berries and the root vegetables, the camas, strawberries, were all enhanced in their growth by being cleared off and setting the ecosystem back to an earlier successional stage. So just give you a couple of examples. Root vegetables were very important. We always think of people here on the coast as living on salmon and maybe deer, but and maybe berries. But often people don't recognize just how many roots people relied on. Different species. I already mentioned the tequila root gardens, but also the camas was very, very important source of roots, and the rice root and other ones as well. And so the way these areas of root production were looked after was through the use of clearing and burning. Also, plots of camas and other root vegetables were owned by particular families who went and checked and looked after them and kept them cleared. The timing of the harvest was really important. The way people harvested selectively and replanted parts of the roots so they would regrow, just like the gagump that I talked about. The ceremonies around root harvesting, so they would have a first roots ceremony to recognize the roots. And roots were not only used by individual families and communities, but they were traded as well. And there are all kinds of stories about roots in the different traditions of the Ntlakatmuk and the other Salish groups, the Haida and so forth.
Nancy, could you tell us what those 4 roots were? Because we mostly know the berries, but we don't necessarily recognize the roots.
Good idea. Thank you for that. Sorry, I didn't before. So the long one that looks a bit like a snake is the silverweed. Pacific silverweed, the glicksam that I mentioned earlier. The bucket at the bottom is camas, the common camas bulbs. The one in my hand there is a big shwee, yellow glacier lily, and the ones up top. Good question. They could be shriveled up balsam root, or they could be mountain potato, which I'll be talking about a little bit, the spring beauty corms. It's hard to tell the size. Anyone want to guess? I'll look it up and I'll let you know. So for camas, for example, forms extensive meadows that have been Here, and especially on the southeast part of Vancouver Island, as far north as Comox and Courtenay, for thousands of years. And their populations extend south into California. And so there's these huge meadows associated with the Garry Oak. And these meadows were partly naturally formed because they're in drier areas, so the evergreen trees don't grow as well. But they were also maintained by the use of fire, as Wayne Suttles, a well-known ethnographer, wrote about at some length. There are two species of bulbs, two species of camas that people harvested the bulbs. And we counted, just based on what my first teacher, Christopher Paul from Sartlip, taught me. He said a family would go out and gather 200-pound gunny sacks full of camas bulbs a year. And there are many families in the Sartlip, so that's a lot of gunny sacks full of camas. And then if you think about the Cowichan and the other people going north as far as Qualicum and even up to the Courtenay, the Comox Valley, and you add it all up, we figured that people were harvesting about 10 million bulbs a year. Because I used horse chestnuts instead of camas bulbs. I didn't have enough, but I filled up containers and counted them out and multiplied that out and figured they were harvesting about 10 million bulbs a year. And so the use of fire really helped to create that, to keep those going. Wayne Suttles worked with Tsok and other Salishan peoples and wrote about the camas that the people he worked with, one woman was responsible for one area of camas, and she's the one who burned it over every few years. And other people could harvest from that site, but they always had to ask permission. So she was able to keep control of the camas and the production. So responsibility for managing the resource was through burning and was delegated to ensure that the resource would continue. And my friend, now Dr. Brenda Beckwith, who's a camas specialist who lives up in Nelson now, but she did her PhD work studying camas, and she planted out salvaged camas bulbs from the highway construction out from Victoria. This was many years ago, and planted them out in these, what do you call those, cold frames at Government House in Victoria. And she monitored them over a period of time. And look what she got. Because she was weeding them, they were separated out, the soil was really good. And that's what she was able to produce with these amazing large camas bulbs from the giant camas. So she just demonstrated the effectiveness of tending. And then together we advised a master's student, Kate Proctor, who studied the camas at the Garry Oak Meadow Preserve at Salmonos Lake in Duncan. And she made plots. She was going to do her master's research by setting out plots in the camas meadow there and burning some of them and harvesting some of them and leaving them some and weeding some of them and leaving some of them. Well, they actually burned over the whole meadow that year, and so she couldn't do that part of the experiment. But what she did do was sample these meter square plots. And this picture shows all of the camas bulbs found in 1 square meter of ground in that area. And we organized them by size. And so the 1-year-old bulbs at the top, they're tiny, teardrop shaped. And they're in the top layer of soil, about top few centimeters. And then the 2-year-old bulbs are more teardrop shaped. And by 3 or 4 years, they elongate and they drill down into the ground. So the oldest bulbs are down below. So the way people harvested using a digging stick, you would dig around the plot with your digging stick, push it down really hard, flip the whole turf over that contains the 1, 2, 3-year-old bulbs, all just still in the turf there. Reach down, select a bunch of bulbs that you want to collect, and then put it back again. This is after the plants have gone to seed. So when you're digging, you're spreading the seed into the upturned soil, and then you give it a quick burn, which apparently was okay. The seeds were down low enough, and the burn was quick enough that it just took the grass and weedy parts off the top and provided a shot of fertilizer for the bulbs themselves. Yeah, and I mentioned the digging stick a few times. It is truly the best tool to use for digging these kinds of roots, because if you use a shovel, it slices the camas bulbs in half, it slices the roots in half and fragments them. A digging stick, you more or less, you push and you pry back, and you use the leverage of the digging stick. And there are many different kinds, and they go back for hundreds, thousands of years. They found digging stick parts in archaeological contexts, which I'll talk about again in a minute. But I have a collection of digging sticks myself, and I really love them. There's one that Mary gave me made of black hawthorn wood. There's the deer antler one that Sam Mitchell gave me. Quaxistella gave me several made out of yew wood. And there's several others that I have as well. So digging stick is an amazing tool. So here we go back. Adam talks about how the individual families had their own tequila gardens. It wasn't just a free-for-all down there, but the whole estuary was staked out by individual families. The Taktus, Liksam, Kwani, Yukum, when they go down the flats, they use little pegs. This is my area. You got your own pegs in the flats, and then you continue on that, digging the soft ground, so it'll grow better every year. I guess that's fertilizing, cultivating. I guess that's the word for it. Every family had pegs, owned their little plots down in the flats. And indeed, you can see these plants are well adapted to regenerating themselves, because here is one bulb of fucum that has all these little bulblets all around it, and each one of them, we proved it, can grow into a new plant. But the gagump, the grandfather, that he's got the sprout from the bottom of the bulb, grows much faster into a mature plant because it's that much bigger. So that's why they planted the gagump. Different ethnographers have reported how people transplanted the tubers of the wapato, the swamp potato they call it. And you might have heard of Wapato. It's a community in Washington named after this beautiful arrowhead leaf plant that has these tubers that people have relied on as food for a long, long time. And we know that up in the Fraser Valley, the Katzie in particular are well-known cultivators of Wapato. And families owned the plots. And when the Hudson's Bay Fort was established up in Fort Langley, they provided Wapato for the fort staff. And so they would clear the area of all kinds of growth, and so the tubers would grow more easily. And guess what? Guess what they found? When they were digging one of the bridges, the base of a bridge, they found an area that was over nearly 4,000 years old, maybe even older, of old Wapato tubers that were waterlogged and preserved because they were waterlogged, together with the tips of digging sticks embedded with them. Nothing else, just pure Wapato with digging sticks embedded, going back thousands of years. Isn't that neat? So if some of you are interested in that, I can give you the reference for the papers that they wrote about that. And here we have Baptist Ritchie from Mount Currie told this amazing story, first in the Sletlimuk or Lilwet language, and then it was translated into English by a linguist named Leon Swoboda. And it's called, in English, Burning Mountainsides for Better Crops. And he talked about how people used fire, his ancestors used fire. When it gets too bushy, then the ripe berries disappear and the roots, the scamach, that's the glacier, their name for the glacier lily, skimuta, the tiger lily bulbs, squanquina, the mountain potato or spring beauty, they disappear. Then they burned. It was marked out, and there one did his own burning. So again, people, families, communities were looking after specific areas up in the mountains around Mount Currie. They used to burn that grass above timberline. When they burned the grass, they used to say the Indian potatoes, that is the spring beauty corms, were as big as your fist. Now they're only that big, like marbles or smaller, because they're not cultivated. That's what he said in his story. That was way back in 1977 or earlier. And we know that, well, I'll talk about the mountain potato a little bit more later. And I was up near where I worked with Sam Mitchell, near Hatlip, north of Lillooet, along the river there. There'd been a fire there at Hatlip, at the base of the Fountain Valley. And so I stopped and I got out of the car and I walked up through the burned pine forest. And guess what I found? Nodding onions, this tall. I couldn't believe it. I'd never seen them like that. It was after a fire, and the shot of nutrients that they got from the fire, plus the opening and the sunshine that they got, just made it a perfect place for growing Kwalawa ul, the real onion, Kwalawa ul. And when they used to burn that grass, I think I said that already. Am I going backwards?
Yeah.
Or maybe I put it in twice, just for fun.
Keep us awake.
Yeah. And for the Tsilkotan people, there was a tradition, a ceremony that I was told about. If a woman loses her husband and she's in grief and she just can't get over her bereavement, they tell her, go up on the mountain being up where they call the Potato Mountains, above Namaya, and grab up some plants of the mountain potato, the tsuntani, and throw them out to places where there's no potatoes growing. That will really ease your heart. That will really make you feel better. Well, I happened to be up there working on a court case with the Tsilkotan a few years back, and I just happened to have found some of the plants that had gone to seed, that had gone to flower, and the old flowers were still on the dried stems, and so I had pulled them up, and I put them into an envelope, and I sort of forgot about them for a few weeks. And when I opened the envelope, guess what? The seeds had ripened and come out, and there they are, those little black dots in that place where the ruler is. Those are the old flowering plants, and those little black dots are the seeds. And we planted out those seeds, and guess what? They grow into new plants. Surprise, surprise. But that's why the Tsilkotan say they're the ones responsible for all the potatoes on Potato Mountain, because they've been looking after those potato patches for years and thousands of years in that area. And it is just like the stars in the heavens when you go up there. It's just so amazing. And then just a little bit about berries. I've already mentioned a bit about the use of fire. But all of these berries were cared for, intended to promote their productivity. The black caps, the huckleberries, the strawberries, the different kinds of strawberries, the trailing blackberry, the native blackberry, all of those were tended as well. And they were ones that Baptist Ritchie mentioned as being really producing well after a fire. So they were also managed in different ways depending on what kind of bushes they were, as well as fire. They would use pruning, coppicing. I was thinking of that with the serviceberry, Saskatoon berry, because Mary Thomas told me that her mother used to take the big Saskatoon bushes that were really tall and cut them right back down to the ground. And then they would show up, and the first year or so, you could get shoots that you could use around the top of your birch bark basket, the wides, the long straight ones. And then you leave it for a few years later, and then you get lots and lots of berries. And so that's just one example based on the Robin's favorite plant there that she's writing about, the Saskatoon. And here's Adam Dick again, Quaxistala. As soon as they pick all the berries, we weed, break them. We break them so the berries would grow. See, a lot of people think we never touched the wild berries, but we did. We cultivated it. We pruned it, especially that guadams, the red huckleberries. When they finished picking the guadams, they pruned them. They break the tops off. And they did that routinely. Not just Adam, but the other nations as well. And here's Sam Mitchell talking about fire. They would burn every 5 or 6 years. Now it's only timber grows. It takes away from the other. They burned at Lillooet to make the raspberries, and west of Lillooet for the huckleberries. That was back in 1974 when he was talking about that. And Annie York, I can still hear her voice. Lots of huckleberries, lots of blueberries. They wait until close to fall. They know just when to burn. And then 2 or 3 years after, lots of huckleberries, lots of blueberries. And the scamach, that's the glacier lily again. That's when it grows, when you burn. I've seen it when the old people used to do it. I was just a little girl. I'd go up the mountain with Granny. After we'd pick berries, my uncle would say, it's going to rain pretty soon, time to burn. So the fire wouldn't spread. So they watch very carefully. They know what they're doing when they do these fires. They don't just haphazardly start them. They watch, they know that it's going to be put out. They sometimes burn between the confluence of 2 creeks so that the fire will go along the ground and stop at the edges of the creeks. Lots of knowledge needed for that. He stays up after they finish picking, and then we go back the next year, it's all burned.
That's a picture, that's a dry root.
Yes, that is the dried glacier lily, scamach root, or shwich. Mary would call it shwich, and Annie would call it scamach. Yeah, and that's the root itself. Everyone had their own berry patches, just like everyone had their own clam beds. Things like the salal, salmon berries, and all that. All kinds of berries, wild crabapple. You don't just go out and pick. There's certain places a certain family goes, especially the wild crabapples. Our family used to go over here, other families over there, and they got markers too, the cello crabapples. Oh yes, they put pegs. You put pegs all around the tree. You just pick up those little sticks and you put it around the tree. Anything that's pegged, you know it's someone's. And then you have places that are remarkable because they reflect the confluence of all of these different management systems, plus how they looked after the fish, the salmon, the clams, the shellfish. And one of those sites that I had the privilege of going to and working around was at Hoyat on the North Hunter Island in the Heiltsuk territory. And there's Desiree Lawson there. I just saw her last week at the ceremony for the Clam Garden defense of Sky Augustine at the Tsumenis Nation. And Desiree is working on clam gardens as well. But you can go to the website and look up Hoyat and find out all about this amazing site that has crabapple trees, culturally modified cedars, root gardens, berry gardens, amazing stinging nettle as high as this that people would have cultivated for its fiber. I could go on and on about these things, but this is looking out at Hoyat at the river estuary from the village site, an old village site. There's the stinging nettle. The gooseberries were so big and so delicious, and the cow parsnip, everything had obviously been cared for. Some of it would have been planted there, and it was there for thousands of years. So, not hunter-gatherers, they got it wrong. My friend Daisy Seawood-Smith, Mayanuth, talked about it. See, people didn't believe that we did this. They think that nature just grows on its own. But our people felt to get more harvest and a bigger berry, they did these things. Same thing a farmer does. I can see Daisy so clearly. She got an honorary degree from UVic. The first time I met her was about that time. The newcomers were blind to these practices, conveniently so, I say. So we have Joseph Trutch, for example. I'm satisfied from my own observation that the claims of Indians over tracts of land on which they assume to exercise ownership, but of which they make no real use, operate very materially to prevent settlement and cultivation. Isn't that ironic? And I could go on and on. My daughter Kate and I wrote a paper called Where Our Women Used to Get the Food, and it's talking about the Kingcome estuary and how the Halliday family came and settled there and cut down all the crabapple trees and destroyed the root gardens. But that's another story. Right now, we need to think very positive thoughts. There are lots of really excellent projects and learning experiences that are happening all over. And just to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, somehow all of this knowledge fits into that really well. It makes us really appreciate and respect Indigenous peoples and their ancestors going back for thousands of years, the original inhabitants, the original caretakers of the place that most of us call home now as well. So with careful observation, experimentation, collaboration, sharing, and recognition of Indigenous peoples' rich knowledge and their rights, much can be done to restore some of these practices and enhance the growth, productivity, and quality of Indigenous peoples' foods, materials, and medicines. So thank you very much.
Whoops. So I don't know if you can hear me. We'd like some questions. There are some online as well as here. Let's go with a question in person first.
The question is, was the stinging nettle fiber, was it used for food or for something else?
Weaving.
Weaving. And so, yes, stinging nettle is a well-known source of fiber for fishing nets and line and cordage. It's very, very strong, and it's used not only here in North America, but right around the circumpolar region in Scotland, in Sweden, and the USSR too, I think, Russia, I should say, sorry. And But here, yeah, people would harvest it in the fall for its fiber. They also use it medicinally as a counter-irritant for arthritis and rheumatism and for other purposes as well. And I think, as I understand it from various elders I've worked with, they learn to eat to cook and eat the young shoots of stinging nettle from the European newcomers. Just like they learned about watercress and dandelion and a few other species like that. But stinging nettle itself has always been here, and it's always been used in that way. It's very important, along with fireweed, the other source of fiber. Yeah.
Question?
So Jane or Jeff Sherritt asked on Zoom, were camas meadows found in the Greater Vancouver area as well as on Vancouver Island?
And what a great question. There are patches of camas on the mainland in different places, not necessarily around Vancouver, but opposite in the Seashell area and a few other places, maybe up around Yale. And there's some studies that indicate, genetic studies that indicate that these populations, like the Garry oaks that are found in a few places on the mainland, might have been brought over and planted long ago by First Peoples. There's indications of transplanting. We did a paper called Adopting a Root about how people move plants around and brought them from one place to another. So I think the camas populations that are occurring naturally are mostly on southeastern Vancouver Island, but they also get over into the Port Alberni area, and there's some up in the unglaciated area on the northwest side of Vancouver Island. So they've not just been influenced by humans, but just by their natural distribution as well. It's okay. I was asked to speak about the traditional uses of cow parsnip, Heracleum maximum now, used to be lanatum, in the carrot celery family. And this is a really fascinating plant that is mostly known as a food plant, although it's also known, the roots are used medicinally and for some people, like Mary Thomas knew how to use them. But the thing you need to know about the cow parsnip, it has a compound that is activated in the presence of sunlight to cause severe skin irritation. And so people had to learn right off the start how to use the cow parsnip for food. You have to be very careful. And I know this because I was picking some cow parsnip once, and I accidentally got some on my upper arm, and I got blistering all down my arm, red, big blisters that didn't go away for months. And that was from the phototoxins in the cow parsnip. But if you peel it, you can eat both the young bud stalks, which are called the male, and the young leaf stalks, which are the female. And both of those were eaten in the springtime only, and again, with great care. You have to peel them, and you can't let the hairs get on your skin, or if you expose your skin to the sun, you have to be really careful. Does that answer? Okay.
I just wanted to say one thing, which is that as a child growing up in North Vancouver, there was a plant that we called poison Indian rhubarb. And of course, at that time, I had no idea what it was, but that was what it was. But I had no idea why it was poison, but that's the name that we knew that plant as, was poison Indian rhubarb.
Yeah, it is often called Indian rhubarb or wild rhubarb, but another plant is as well, and that's the dock. There's a native western dock, and they call that wild rhubarb as well, tlacos. In Haida, tlacos, which is the name for rhubarb as well. Yeah. Oh, the question was about camas growing in the estuarine water in Port Alberni, the Somas River, and also out on Johnson Island in the middle of the Alberni Inlet. you find the camas growing. I've taken pictures of camas out on that island with seaweed in it because it's growing in an intertidal zone where the tide came right up over the flowers and left bits of seaweed in it. So that would be I hope I'm right here. I'll have to put out a correction if I'm wrong, but I think that's the common camas, Camassia quamash, not the giant Camassia like Linny. But I was amazed to see it out there. I hadn't seen it before, and we went out with Earl McQuina George one time in his boat and saw it growing with the wild rice root, with the chocolate lily rice root, and a few other kind of intertidal species. That was amazing. It's such a flexible kind of plant, I guess. Oh, Cheatlanjau. She wants me to talk about Devil's Club. And Devil's Club is an amazing shrub in the Araliaceae, related to, come on, my brain isn't working. Thank you, ginseng, thank you. Yeah, related to ginseng and the ginseng family. And it's very, very prickly, and the prickles can be very irritating. But nevertheless, it's a very, very important medicinal plant, and people use it. When I first went to Haida Gwaii, the very first time I was told about it being used to treat arthritis, and how people would bathe their arthritic limbs in a solution of Devil's Club, and it really, really helped. But it's also used for many, many other things, to treat colds and coughs, and just as a general tonic for people. And one of the tragedies that's happened on Haida Gwaii is since the deer were introduced, they've been browsing the Devil's Club, and you can hardly find any Devil's Club anymore, and yet it was and is one of the most important Haida medicines. You can only find it now growing on vertical cliffs someplace where the deer can't get. So,
was it the leaves that they used?
No, sorry, it wasn't the leaves, it was the inner bark mostly and so what you would do, you would never harvest the whole plant. You would take the daughters or the granddaughters of the plant and leave the grandmother in place. That is the main root, which can spread along the ground. And my friend Trevor Lance did his master's work on Devil's Club and on its growing conditions. So people were very careful, like Luschin will say, he uses it for medicine, but he would always be very careful. Take just the daughter or the granddaughter shoots and always replant some of the pieces because it will root itself. And so that was one way of keeping it living. And then you scrape the spines off with a knife, and then you shave off the bark, the outer bark you take off, and it's the greenish inner bark that has the medicinal qualities mostly. I have some in my necklace, given to me by Haida folks in Masset. Yeah, these are Devil's Club beads.
There are more questions here.
There's one comment. Maggie says, First Nation make beads out of Devil's Club.
They do.
They can't see your beads.
Yeah. So they do. They're
Are they giving off vibes?
yeah, they do. They do. I really love them. And I have quite a few that have been presented to me over the years, and I really love them. Yeah.
Another question.
Oh, another question. Oops. What species of blueberries were cultivated?
Oh, species of blueberries. What species of blueberries, and we could say huckleberries and cranberries, were cultivated because they're all in the same genus, Vaccinium. And I guess the one that is sometimes just called the berry, like the number one berry, is the Black Mountain huckleberry, Vaccinium membranaceum, which tends to grow in higher elevations in the subalpine, but you can find it in forested areas as well. So that's one of the most common. There's also the two tall blueberry bushes, Vaccinium ovalifolium and Vaccinium alaskense. They used the fruit a lot of those. There's a lower one that grows in peat bogs. Well, there's several that grow in peat bogs. That, like Vaccinium uliginosum is one. There's Vaccinium myrtillus. All of them were, and of course the red huckleberry, Vaccinium parvifolium, was also harvested. And then you have the bog cranberry, Vaccinium, sometimes called oxycoccus or Vaccinium oxycoccus, and the low bush cranberry, Vaccinium vitusidea or lingonberry, which I had the privilege of picking in Sweden as well because the Sami people use that one, and so do a lot of others. I've probably missed a whole bunch because there's about 20 of them altogether, but that's the main ones.
There's a question, this gentleman at the back row.
I didn't hear you speak about fungi or mushrooms. Are they commonly?
Fungi or mushrooms. I'm so glad you said something about them because I actually belong to the Fungi Foundation, which is an international organization to which Paul Stamets and others belong, that is trying to raise the awareness and the profile of fungi as very important organisms in the world. And we shouldn't be just saying flora and fauna, but now we've convinced the biodiversity convention people that we need to say flora, fauna, and fungi because the mushrooms and fungi play such an important role in our ecosystems and are really what connect everything. Paul Stamets wrote the book Running Mycelium about that very idea, and other people have written about it too. But people did use fungi. On the coast, they didn't eat mushrooms very much, just maybe the witch's butter, the tremolo, and a couple of others just as nibbles. But Annie York and the people in the interior, the Schwetmuch, Annie, Mary Thomas, for example, they harvested several kinds of mushrooms, including the pine mushroom, Tricoloma magnifileri, and Tricoloma populinum. We wrote a paper. I went out with my friend Harriet Kuhnlein with Hilda Austin from Lytton, and she took us out to the Nicola River in the fall. It was Thanksgiving weekend, I remember, and she showed us how to pick cottonwood mushrooms, Tricoloma populinum. And you find them, you see heaps of cottonwood leaves, and you know that there's a big bunch of them underneath, and then you pick them off, you tap them with your knife so all the sand falls out because it's sandy soil, and then you bring them home, you separate the caps and the stems, you peel the caps, and you fry them. And honestly, those are the best mushrooms I ever tasted. They were just amazing. They also, some people eat morels, and then Edith O'Donoghue found a species of mushroom called slippery top, schletche, in the Slatlemoch language, that had never been collected in British Columbia before. Gliocyclus? Oh gosh, I can't remember the name of it, but if you're interested, you can send me an email and I'll let you know the name of the slippery. Oh, Hygrophorus gliocyclus. That's it. Yeah. Slippery top, a new mushroom that they ate in the Lillooet area, but no mycologist had collected it. yet. The question is, is the way people tend plants and look after them, does that vary across? It varies to some extent, depending on what species people are using, but often they're very similar practices over wide regions. The replanting of propagules, for example, or the scattering of berries isn't just limited to one group, but is more widespread. And I'm sure people spread the word a lot, just like Robin talks about in her book, about how people share knowledge and practices, and it changes and adapts to different places, but the general procedures are the same, whether it's digging the chemist's bulbs selectively or the sweep or other roots.
There's a question in the back somewhere? Yes?
Yeah, well, I was originally gonna ask you a berry question, but the mushrooms came up, so I'm
Oh.
gonna ask you the mushrooms.
My Taltan name is Berry Woman, by the way. Jita Egaden.
Sorry, who is?
My Taltan name is berry.
Oh.
It means berry woman.
Oh, interesting. My Sutu name is a funny short guy, so. Long story. Well, you know, when I was, it's funny that mushrooms weren't as big a thing, because I remember, you know, growing up with my mom, she'd always take me chanterelle hunting, you know, down in Oregon.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
you know, she'd always be like, oh yeah, you know, you go out after the second good rain, and you look under a Doug fir, and then you'll find, in the fall, you'll find an orange mushroom. And I was like, well, who told you that, you know? So if it wasn't, is it not a First Nations practice? Is it more of a European thing? I guess that's what's on my mind. Who foraged the mushrooms?
The First Nations in the interior, like Annie York, the question was, is using mushrooms, was that learned from, say, Europeans, because not everybody used them? And the answer is, it seems to me, because they have names in their own languages, they're long-term practices in some areas that people use mushrooms. And thinking of chanterelles, Annie York called those little fish gills, if you translate the name for chanterelle. So people were familiar with some of them, and but in general, puffballs and mushrooms, especially puffballs, if you look at the names for them, thunder excrement. And ghosts. Anyway, associated with supernatural, with weather, and there are, you know, traditions that if you pick a certain puffball, it will cause storms and that kind of thing. So it's a mixed bag, but those traditions go back a long ways. And if you're interested, I can send you a paper that Alain Courier at U of Montreal and I wrote together published a couple years ago on mushroom use, that would probably answer some of your question.
That'd be lovely. Thank you.
Sure, just let me know. Send me an email. The question is, did people in this area use controlled breeding, like use the flowering, the flowers themselves to promote or select different varieties of things? And I'm not really aware of any that I can think of. I need to give that some thought, because certainly people were very aware of flowers and the bees and, you know, maybe not pollination, the mechanism of pollination per se, but certainly the idea that bees eat flower nectar, and that's an important part, and likely that the more bees there are, the more seeds they're going to produce. But I'm only speculating there. I haven't talked or heard anybody talk about that. So it's a really good question. Yeah. And I know there was one more that really anxious.
Okay, who was really anxious?
I just want to say, well, first, thank you for all your research, and you actually inspired. I'm environmental restoration. I do restoration work in Southeast Vancouver and steward a trail system, and we planted a food forest, quote unquote, inspired by the work you were doing a couple years ago.
It's across the street from where we live. We'll take you there tomorrow.
Yeah, I was part of that as well. So yeah, I just want to say thank you first for your research. But then a little question, if you had a moment. You said at the beginning you wish your work could be applied to environmental restoration, and it could be applied currently to restoration. Just if you have any quick tips or tidbits of how this research could be applied to restoration, active restoration.
Yeah, the question is, and I'll just answer it very quickly because I know we're running out of time, but am I aware of how the information that I have shared with you tonight can be applied in restoration, in ecological restoration, or I call ecocultural restoration? And the answer is yeah, so many ways. I'm currently working with a group where I live on Protection Island, and we're restoring a wetland beside the community garden. It used to be much more extensive, and then it was filled in with old car parts and everything, and the Himalayan blackberries taken over. And so we're using some of these techniques and the knowledge, and we're trying to recreate a restored area that is meaning for this local Snuneymuxw people, working with my friend Geraldine Manson from Snuneymuxw. So I think involving the First Nations in restoration is a wonderful idea, and that will really make it very special and give it that higher profile, I think. Thank you.
Which is, I know you talked about plants being kind of maybe brought to them, and other things. Were plants or like viable corms and cuttings or whatever actively traded, or would it have been more that your daughter-in-law had kind of moved to the coast and you took something down to her kind of thing?
That's a great question. Were people actively transplanting propagules, corms, and bulbs,
or trading
and so forth,
them with other
or trading? A little bit of both. And just to wrap up very quickly, the name for Wapato in the Cowichan language, and also around this area, Musqueam, is Kokolots. And when I learned about Wapato from Mary Thomas, way up in Shuswap Lake, guess what their name is? Kokolots. The same name is held right between Vancouver Island and way up into the east of the Okanagan. And Lucy Marvin Charlie told me that their people used to travel as far up as Kamloops anyway. And so you can almost use the names of these plants to demonstrate that they weren't just traded physically, but the information went with them because of the name that people have for them in the different languages. That had to come with it. Yeah.
And Stefan. So I just want to thank